Hey, AP Bio, it's me, Miss Willis. We're going to talk about communication today and specifically how the nervous system ties into animal communication and increases the chance for survival. So let's go ahead and get started. You probably already know that organisms do exchange information with their environment, and they do this by responding to cues or stimuli that may be present in their environment. And of course, they change their behavior to ensure their survival from that cue or stimulus. So a classic example is what you see here. You see this deer species encircling their young. Obviously, there was probably some sort of cue in nature that told them, hey, you might want to protect your young here in this environment. And so they circled them so that they would survive. In communicating with their environment, there's a whole bunch of different types of signals or cues that organisms can use, but ultimately these cues are meant to produce some sort of change with the organism. Thus, it will affect their reproductive success. So that means they can survive. So for example, we've often seen organisms, they'll mark their territory with urine or other items, smells, and that is meant to tell the other species like, hey, stay out, this is my area. Sometimes animals use cues to indicate their dominance. So something like the gorilla beating on the chest would definitely indicate that that is the main dominant species or alpha male in the area. Bird songs are also another great communication example. Birds, they sing songs, whether they be innate or learned. They're often used for a variety of reasons, mating, warning calls, etc. But again, they're all meant for communication to change behavior of that organism. One of the neat things I've read about, which I believe also was on an AP test once, was something called the waggle dance by bees. And so the bees, they obviously send out scouts to look for nectar. And once they find that nectar source, the scout will remember where the location is. And the way they do that is in a dance. And so they bring that location dance back to the forager bees, and they'll go ahead and dance for them. And then through that movement, then those forager bees will know where the nectar is, and then they go out and collect it and bring it back to the hive. Tying this into natural selection, just remember that these communication cues, whether they're innate or learned, so they were born with it or they learned it, ultimately they will stay in the population if it does increase their chances for survival and reproductive fitness. If that cue does not increase survival, then chances are it won't be passed on to the next generations and it will fade out over time. And an example of something that obviously has worked over time is cooperative behavior. So here you see dolphins, they are working together to kind of herd and school the fish. And then once they get them in this nice little ball, each dolphin will take turns picking off a fish from the outside of that school. So definitely learning to work with others increases the overall chances of fitness and survival for this dolphin population. Now, there are four main categories that most of these behaviors will be classified under. So there's visual, auditory, tactile, and chemical forms of animal communication. So visual, obviously, the organisms can see each other and respond through the cues visually with their eyes. Auditory, there's a sound involved, and that sound will be the cue. Tactile involves touching. So a touching cue is involved and that will change behavior. And then lastly, there are chemical cues. And so either maybe a chemical smell or spray is used, and that will be a cue for other organisms or organisms within that population. But these are the four main classifications for how animals communicate with one another. Now, animals, they do have nervous systems, and if it wasn't for the nervous system, it would be a lot more difficult to respond and communicate with the world that's happening around us. So these nervous systems are used to detect external as well as internal signals and then transmit and integrate that information throughout the human body and, of course, produce responses that will ultimately increase the fitness of the population. Now, the neuron is the basic cell of the nervous system. So I know this looks like a funny looking cell, but it actually has a lot of the same parts as a normal cell that you've learned in regular biology. So on the upper left, you see these weird finger-like projections. They're called dendrites, and those are the first parts of the neuron that actually receive the electrical impulse. In the middle part there, you have what we kind of consider like the normal cell. It is the cell body. It's a functional cell, and it's got all the parts like mitochondria and so forth that makes it a cell. It also has a nucleus, so that green circle thing is the nucleus, and that's where the genetic material is found. Okay, going to the right, that is called the axon, and the axon has a lot of parts to it. The yellow looking stuff is called myelin. It's composed of a fat and protein, and its main job is to insulate the axon and help it pass on the electrical signal. The nodes of Ranvier are the little sections in between the myelin, and then the little cells that are in between the myelin, those are called Schwann cells. And Schwann cells, their main purpose is to actually make the myelin that will insulate the axon. At the end of the neuron, you have what's called the axon terminal, and this is where chemicals called neurotransmitters are released, and they will go into the middle section there called the synapse and be passed on to the neighboring neuron. So that's actually how the signals get passed on from neuron to neuron. They're not touching each other. It's chemicals called neurotransmitters that will be passed on through the synapse. Now, the message is actually passed on through an electrical signal. That's called an impulse. And so you can see here in the picture, the electrical signals or impulses, they are started first at the dendrites, then they pass on through the cell body to the axon, out to the axon terminal, where neurotransmitters are released, and then those go to the neighboring neuron. There are 3 different types of neurons. The first one is called the sensory neurons, and these are taking information from the sense organs and relaying that information to the brain and the spinal cord. At the brain and the spinal cord, there are neurons called interneurons that actually connect the information to the motor neurons. And then the motor neurons are the last ones. They carry the impulse from the brain and spinal cord out to the muscles to cause some sort of reaction to the cue. And this picture did come up on an AP test before, so you can see if your hand gets near a match or a flame, it would be the sensory neurons that send that information to your brain or spinal cord, which is where the interneurons are found. They process that information and send out the signal back out through your motor neurons, and hopefully they're telling your hand to move away from the flame. Okay, so say you come across a smell and you smell something and it's got to be processed. So what does your body do? Well, the first thing is that in that odor, there are receptor proteins, receptors that bind onto your olfactory sensory neurons in your nose. So in your nose, and you have these everywhere too, but in your nose specifically, you do have these receptors and they bind together. Now that triggers, that cue, that stimulus triggers what's called an action potential, and that will send a signal from your sensory neurons to your brain where your interneurons are. And I'll talk more about an action potential in just 1 second. Okay, and then of course your brain processes that and it sends a message out to your motor neurons through that processing in the brain or spinal cord. And then of course, if you don't like the smell, that message is going to tell your motor neurons through your muscles, hey, why don't you walk away? I don't really like that smell. It doesn't smell very good. So that's kind of an example of how it would work in a scent kind of scenario. In order to start the message, your neurons and the receptors, they must reach some kind of threshold. So there's got to be some sort of stimulus that is strong enough to activate the neuron. So once the threshold is reached, that message is passed on through the neuron. So let's look at specifically what's happening in the neuron. So the way the electrical signal gets passed on through neuron to neuron to neuron is through ion movement. And the two in particular that you're going to see that come up a lot is sodium and potassium. And if you've ever watched Mr. Anderson's video, you'll know he'll call it salty banana. And so that's a good way to kind of remember it. So when the neuron is at rest, it's got a charge of about negative 70 millivolts. What is happening in the neuron is that sodium is being pumped out. This is an active transport method, so it does require ATP, and potassium is being pumped in. So if you can remember salty banana, just remember salt out, potassium in. But as soon as there is a stimulus threshold, that gets reversed, and that process is called depolarization. So instead of sodium going out, now sodium comes in and potassium goes out. So it's reversed. It's no longer salty banana, it's banana salty, and we call that the action potential. Okay, and so that change of ions, the sodium and potassium, actually will then cause a chain reaction to the neighboring parts of the cell. And it keeps going like that down the axon, down to the terminal. Of course, when the electrical signal has passed, there is a process called repolarization where the cell, the neuron, goes back to normal. So then it would return back to salty banana, salt being pumped out, potassium being pumped back in. When the signal does get passed on through the neuron, it will reach the axon terminal. And at the axon terminal, there are these little chemicals that are released from the axon terminal, and they're called neurotransmitters. And as you can see here in the very cute animation, these neurotransmitters will go into the synapse and transmit information to the neighboring neurons' dendrites. Some very common neurotransmitters that you may have heard of that continue to pass on the message to the neighboring neuron are acetylcholine, epinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. So if you ever see those on the AP test, no, they're just neurotransmitters that are being released to pass on a message. Now, these neurotransmitters, they do cause a response in the neighboring neurons. So it really depends. Sometimes they may be at an area where there's a muscle and it will cause muscle contraction. It will cause some sort of response. These responses in the neurons, they can be stimulatory, so they might stimulate something, or they could be inhibitory, so like it's causing something to not happen. But ultimately, do remember the reason why you do have this nervous system and this ability to pass on messages is to increase your survival. So you want to be able to communicate with your environment in a quick and efficient way. And because we have nervous systems, we can do that and we can survive. All right, everyone, that's it. Have a good day. I'll see you later.